All right, so we're going to go over, um, since the start of the crisis, basically since we were sent home, myself and the others in the center have been doing a lot of work tracking the economic situation with a particular focus on the impacts here in the state. So we're going to go over some of the work we've been doing and talk about some of the impacts. Both we're going to focus on what's going on in the state, but we'll also talk about some national results as well. So if you're not familiar, I presume a lot of you came from this location, but we've been updating our website regularly. We actually pushed some updates today. We had, in particular, a report which went out yesterday, which the chancellor was behind as well, looking at options for reopening the economy, looking at the trade-offs associated with the economic and health factors which have to be considered when thinking about loosening some of the social distancing restrictions that we've had so far. So we'll touch on that, but we're going to focus more on just some of the economic background, the situation here in the state. So we'll start with just status quo ante, thinking about, remembering where we were before all of this happened through mid-March. Then we're going to spend a lot of time particularly focused on the labor market and the situation in unemployment. That's where we've seen some of the biggest impact and where we can also measure things on a daily frequency. One of the difficulties in analyzing a situation like this, which is really unprecedented, is trying to find data to really get a sense of what's going on. A lot of official data takes a lot longer to come out, and since so much has changed so quickly, it's been difficult to find good sources to get a sense of how large have been the impacts. So we'll talk about some of the work we've been doing, which uses some relatively novel data sets. In particular, we've been tracking economic activity based on cell phone locations, so foot traffic data based on GPS locations of people on cell phones, where they go, what different types of businesses they visit, and so on. I'll talk briefly about a couple of the sectors which have been hit hardest, transportation in particular, airlines. Airline traffic is, airlines are still operating, but traffic is down about 95%. And we've also had some additional resources looking at actual household consumption, both nationally and within the state. We'll talk about how consumer behavior has changed in response to what we've seen in this crisis. And then finally, we'll talk about a little bit of regional variation. A lot of stuff I'm going to be doing is statewide. We'll look at some regional variation within the state. And then I'll touch on some of the policy responses. So kind of a long list of things, so we'll dive right in. We think about where we were at the beginning of the year and up through March. We'd gone through the sharp recession 2008. We'd had a very long expansion, roughly from 2010 up until really the end of last year. We just had first quarter GDP numbers came out today, so we had the roughly negative 5% growth in the U.S. But we'd had this relatively long span of, not overly rapid, but sustained growth. And that happened both in the US, which is shown in black, and Wisconsin, which is shown in red. All right, so, relatively stable 2 to 3% growth for the better part of 10 years, really. So very long expansion, if not overly rapid. Associated with that, we saw vast improvements in the labor market over that decade. Basically, for a decade, we had declining unemployment. The unemployment rate reached 10% nationally following the recession. It had come down to under 4% for the better part of last year. Wisconsin, we'd actually bottomed out at about 3% in the middle of last summer. It ticked up just a little bit, but we're still, under 4%. So very long expansion, which really meant vast improvements in living standards really throughout the distribution and also regionally. Right, we've seen people coming back into the labor market. We've seen incomes going up across the income distribution, all due to the fact that we had this very long boom, again, lasting for such a long time. And hazards of being a forecaster, in January, we put out a forecast at the center. And we, based on the models and based on the data up until that time, had predicted that this recovery would continue. Right? We saw a real GDP growth of about 2.5% for the year, we actually were expecting further declines in unemployment. So going into this crisis, going into this pandemic, really up until mid-March, the U.S. economy and the Wisconsin economy were in very good shape. Again, historically low levels of unemployment in particular. So what happened starting in mid-March? I'm going to show a whole bunch of these pictures. What we're showing here on the left is going to be initial unemployment claims. So this is in Wisconsin. These are people who are filing for unemployment for the first time. And then from that, we're going to get an estimate on a daily frequency of what the unemployment rate is in the state as of that date. So on the left panel, there's two lines, but they basically line up on top of each other, 2020 and 2019. Again, the economy was humming along up until this is the first 2 weeks of March. So very low initial unemployment claims. There's always turnover in the labor market, people leaving jobs, people finding new jobs. And but again, unemployment was basically flat, under 4% over that time. But then starting around March 15th, what happened? We get a huge spike in initial unemployment claims. All right, so this is right about the time when the crisis really took hold, when the nationwide health emergency was declared, when the statewide initial health emergency was declared as well. We see a huge spike in initial unemployment claims. Again, we'd never seen anything like this. This is, 17,000 people per day filing for unemployment. And we see the unemployment rate start to tick up. I'm just going to walk through what happened week by week over the past several weeks. So things really started to pick up, and we had over 20,000 per day at the peak in the next week. These are daily data, so on the weekends they're always going to go down. Not that much happens, not that many claims are filed over the weekends, but even still you can see substantial, or basically increased 10 to 20-fold from 2020 to 2019. Within 2 weeks, we'd gone from 4% unemployment to 10% unemployment. It was really, again, we've never seen changes of this magnitude this quickly previously. Kept ticking up, and this was the peak, highest rate. We had 25,000 people on one day file for unemployment. Somewhat lower numbers after this peak, but these are still very high numbers historically. Again, 10 to 12-fold, so the unemployment rate is still creeping up. And just in the most recent data, this is through yesterday. Through yesterday, the unemployment rate in the U.S., or sorry, in the state was now over, we estimate to now be over 19%. Okay, so we've gone from under 4% to 19% in about 6 weeks. So again, the highest unemployment rate we've ever seen in Wisconsin. Statewide unemployment records only go back to the 1970s. Was about 13% in 1982. So we're 50% above that. Again, and all of this happening roughly within a month. Back to fill that annotation. There we go. This is aggregating those into weekly numbers. And again, through the first part of the year, not a whole lot changed, but then you can see a big spike over a couple of weeks. The big mass of unemployment increases have abated, but they're still running very high. There's two lines on here, one from what the state reports, one from what the federal government reports. They're basically on top of each other. So within, in the peak week, we had about 120,000 people in the state file for unemployment. So again, just massive, a typical week was something more like 1,000. So, or sorry, 10,000. And again, as I said, over this span, we're now, again, through yesterday, up to we're estimating over 19% unemployment. So again, vast expansion in unemployment, nothing like we'd seen before, moving this quickly, this much, this quickly. Again, the same trend has happened around the country, and in particular nationwide. So these are initial unemployment claims in the U.S. Again, just to give a sense of the magnitude. So these are recessions here in 1980, 1990, 2008, but never hit anywhere close to 1 million. Over the past month, we've had, peaks nearly 7 million people in a week. This is zooming in just over the last year. We can see again, I think this was a couple of weeks, 4 million, 7 million, 6 million, then came down to 5 and then 4. Again, vast expansion. And again, this has happened across the country. Actually, Pennsylvania has experienced the largest increases. Pennsylvania has had about a 20 percentage point increase in unemployment in the past month. So labor market, again, we were basically at historically tight levels. The number one complaint businesses registered in the state basically throughout the previous year was difficulty finding people to fill open jobs. And we went from that to slamming on the brakes and massive increase in unemployment. And again, that happened within the state, but it's happened around the country. And again, we see a huge spike nationwide. It's not just unemployment. We're seeing big reductions in overall economic activity. Again, some of this, we'll talk about this a little bit later on. We're still operating under the Safer at Home order, which was imposed on March 25th in the U.S. Closing in the state rather, closing non-essential businesses, limiting travel, but most of the declines in activity occurred well before that. So this is from a new data source. Again, during the crisis, a lot of companies have been very helpful in making new types of data available. This is a data set of hourly workers. So they're mostly at small businesses, typically 1 to 3 store locations. So this data set is particularly concentrated in retail and food and beverage industry. So some of the particular sectors which have been hardest hit by the economic disruptions we've seen. So this is from that data set, looking just at Wisconsin, looking at amongst these hourly workers, how many are working on a daily basis, and how many of the what share of the businesses that they work at are open on those days. And again, this is daily data, so you see a lot of fluctuations and actually bigger declines on weekends. But we're basically seeing 40% of businesses that are employing these hourly workers are closed. Many of them, this is particularly Easter Sunday here, having closing more on the weekends. 40% of businesses and roughly 50 to 55% of workers, hourly workers who had been working in January, now not working at all. So again, it's not just unemployment, not just the people filing for unemployment, it's much broader than that. People just not working. Many of these people are still, or at least a good share of them, are still on payrolls. They're still perhaps getting paid, but they're not working and their businesses are closed. That's focusing on the labor market. To broaden out a little bit, again, it's really difficult in real time to get a sense of what's going on in the economy. What is the magnitude of the changes in economic activity that we've seen? So one of the data sources that we've turned to, which I alluded to at the beginning, was looking at foot traffic from cell phone data. So this is a company called Safecraft, which has made this available. It's all anonymized, so it's, again, safe reporting. But this follows a panel of roughly 10%, I believe, of the population in Wisconsin. So it's a very large sample. Looking at them, basically the number of visits they have to 70,000 different locations around the state. Again, this is a very rough measure of economic activity. We don't know what type of transactions are going on. We don't know sales, but at least this is going to be correlated with overall economic activity. And particularly for some industries like hotels, visits of people to hotels is a pretty good proxy of how many rooms are actually booked. So this is starting the first Sunday in March. We see a huge decline in activity. Again, this is all year-over-year changes. So throughout the first part of the year, there's a lot of lines on here. So just focus on the black one now. That's all of these 70,000 different locations. There's actually some growth. So it was more than 1 for 1. But then we see very rapid from basically March 13th down to March 20th, very rapid shutdown. And it's remained at a very low level since then. So again, overall activity down on the order of about 50%. The other lines on here show different industries. So retail has remained, and amongst all of the industries, has remained relatively stronger. As we'll see later, this is almost entirely driven by grocery stores. So what's going on right now in the economy? People are visiting grocery stores. They're spending a lot on groceries. They're also visiting pharmacies, wholesalers like Sam's Club and Costco. So the retail industry has remained relatively strong. Information, what's captured in information? It's basically the largest component of that is movie theaters. Movie theaters are shut down. So we're not getting really any economic activity there. Again, substantial, a bit of variation across industries, but down substantially across the board. So 50 to 60% declines in overall economic activity. We've seen a sharp reduction even in healthcare over the last couple of weeks. So one of the most striking things about what you wouldn't expect for a pandemic, a global health crisis, is for the healthcare industry to be in trouble. But we've seen increasing reports of health workers being furloughed, hospitals running into financial trouble, essentially because everything is devoted to emergency care and to dealing with this pandemic. All non-essential surgeries, operations, hospital visits, doctor's visits, and so on have been put on hold. So again, very broad-based with variation across industries. This graph, I think, shows the evolution of the pandemic a little bit more. So instead of just looking at year over year, this is actual numbers. So this is hotels on the top, and 2019 is here. And again, we see spikes on weekends. This is daily numbers of visits. And the red here is 2020. So what was the initial phase of economic activity? What did people do at first when the COVID-19 started spreading? Well, people canceled travel plans. Right, so you can see early in March, right? So early in March, before really the virus had even hit the state, we'd seen substantial reductions in hotel visits, and they've remained relatively low. We're looking at 85% reductions sustained over the last month. On the other hand, what happened? Grocery stores, we see a huge spike in activity right around March 15th, and grocery store activity has remained relatively high. We'll see even more impact on grocery stores when we turn to consumer sales in just a second. Okay, so again, overall, large decline in activity, at least according to this admittedly imperfect measure. From this, again, relatively imperfect measure, we then try to estimate what is then the impact on total output. All right, so what we're seeing from this measure of economic activity that's based on foot traffic is what's going on in stores. Of course, we know a lot of activity has been shifted from working in stores to working at home, like I'm doing right now. So a number of different economists have actually tried to estimate what's the share of employment in a particular industry that can be done remotely, can be done at home. And so that's this telework measure here. So in particular, educational services, 80% can be done at home, right? Schools are still in session, working remotely. Universities still in session, working remotely. So a lot of that work can be done at home. So we've seen an 89% fall in people showing up at schools, but that doesn't mean schools aren't still going on. So the adjusted decline is only about 17%. Taking this into account, overall within the state, we've seen about a 30% reduction in GDP. Again, that's our baseline estimate. Year over year change as of April 18th. But again, substantial variation across industries. What industries have been hit hard? Arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation and food services, again, hotels and restaurants in particular. And again, as I mentioned, a little bit surprising ex ante for a health crisis that the healthcare sector is doing so poorly. We estimate roughly a 40% decline in health sector GDP. So again, vast reductions in economic activity, less with things that can be done more remotely, finance and insurance and education, but with the sectors which are hit hardest being hotels, restaurants, and travel and tourism in particular. One of those particular sectors, as I mentioned at the outset, is travel. So this is Our measure coming from foot traffic data lines up actually quite well with measures from the federal government on actual airline traffic, the number of passengers going through security at all airports around the US. From, again, the decline started a little bit earlier, started in earlier March, but you can see a very substantial decline. And we're now looking at 90 to 95% reductions in airline traffic. So planes are still flying. Obviously, there's been a substantial cut in the number of flights, but even the flights that are going are, much lower capacity. Airlines are still running, but at a very low scale. More direct measure of economic activity is actually looking at household consumption. Again, this generally there's lags in this. It's difficult to get good data on consumption. We were able to get some weekly aggregated transaction data from this company, Earnest Research, who provides aggregated consumption data for roughly 6 million consumers across the US. So it's, again, a relatively substantial sample. And it's broken out by the sector, right? So what are the sales on? Where do they take place geographically? And also the channel. Is it done online versus in-store? So this will allow us to get at how much, right? We've seen a big decline in in-store activity, but how big has been the shift to what's taking place online? So looking at sales growth overall, and again, this is showing the US and Wisconsin, the patterns are roughly similar, so I won't really delve into the distinction between the two. There was actually a big spike in overall retail sales at the end of March, increases year over year on the order of 15%, but then reductions later in the month. That increase, so if nationwide, the retail sales are reported monthly. Retail sales had fallen about 9% in the month, but that really masked this big change. Right, so it was ramping up early in the month and then down drastically later in the month. What's been the big increase? It's been grocery stores. Right, so we have year over year growth of 80 to 100% in the middle of the month. That peak, that sort of spike of panic buying, as people went into quarantine, as there was more and more restrictions in different states around the country. People stocked up on groceries. Grocery store shelves were bare. Difficult to get a lot of commodities. We saw 80 to 100% increases in grocery store sales. It's come down, but still remains high. We're still looking at roughly 30% increase in grocery store sales. What's fallen off a cliff? Restaurants and travel. Restaurants, dine-in locations are closed. Full-service restaurants have moved towards takeout in order to at least provide some revenue. But overall, we're still, seeing 30 to 40% reductions in sales. Travel down even more. We're on the order of 80%. And again, that includes both hotels and airlines and all transportation. Again, big change in overall activity, but also a shift, right? So as fewer people are going out to eat, they're eating more at home. Again, just what you would expect given the health risks that we're facing today. One of the biggest, again, we've seen a number of graphs which look like this, which are just kind of striking. You never see pictures which look like this. This is nationwide clothing and clothing accessory sales. So basically, total sales of clothing in the US fell by 50% in 1 month. Right, so it's basically wiped out 20 years of growth in 1 month. Again, you don't see plots like that just falling off a cliff very often. Looking at, again, the composition, the changes in sales, how have consumers responded to this pandemic while they've moved online? All right, so again, this is just looking at Wisconsin. Overall sales are down about 20%, but online sales are up about 20%, in-store down 30%. Okay, so online sales still make up a smaller part of the overall bundle, but they make up an increasing share. So people have moved, this is just looking at transactions, from going to the store to shopping online. Not only have they switched their mode of activity, they've actually switched how much they're purchasing. Right, so think of if there's any cost of going to the store, and here there's particularly a potential health cost of going to the store. What are you going to do? You're going to go less frequently, and when you do go, you're going to buy more. And that's just what we see. We see, looking at, here this is total sales, and then looking at grocery stores, a reduction in overall sales, but an increase in the average size of sales, and a sharper reduction in transactions. So overall sales are down. People are going to the store less often, but when they go to the store, they're buying more. And that's particularly true with grocery stores. The spike in grocery store sales was driven at least as much by an increase in average size. So, and that average size has remained high, meaning now when people go to the grocery store, they're buying on average 40% more than they did when they visited the grocery store a year ago. So again, big change in sector, right? Shifting from travel, dining out, to groceries, eating at home. Big move online, which has allowed, again, consumers to cushion the impact of this pandemic. Right? So we've still been able to, purchase from Amazon and still been able to consume, but that's also diverted a lot of sales, right? So instead of going to smaller businesses, local retailers, people are buying from online purchases, which tend to be larger national retail chains. So there's been a bigger shift in activity, which has hit different parts of different retailers, different sectors much harder. So again, that was looking at overall economic activity, looking at household consumption. Of course, there's been big change in financial markets as well. From February until the middle of March, what's shown here, this is an index of the overall US stock market value as measured by the S&P 500, as well as the value of publicly traded companies in Wisconsin. So that's in the blue. You see that they followed roughly the same pattern, but Wisconsin companies actually fared a little bit worse. Right, so we had dramatic decline in financial markets. We saw basically a reduction of 2/3 of the value, or sorry, 1/3 of the value of publicly traded companies in Wisconsin. Since that time, there's been recovery. Right, so we had a very sharp bear market followed by a sharp bull market, but we still remain roughly 20% off where we were in late February. Okay, so big decline in financial markets. That decline, stabilized, and we've seen some growth since then. But overall values still remain roughly 20% down, 15% down nationwide, 20% down in the state. So again, that reflects the concentration of industries in the state. Wisconsin's a more manufacturing heavy state. Agriculture has still been hit hard with this crisis. So far, I've been talking a lot about things at the national or statewide level. So I just want to look a little bit about what's happened to different regions, different counties in the state. So this graph shows on the left the unemployment rate, again with different levels of shading. Darker is a higher unemployment rate in February of 2020, before the crisis started, and then our estimate through April 18th, which is the latest regional data we have. So first off, you see again, not only was unemployment very low in the beginning part of the year, it was almost uniformly low across the state. It was a little bit higher in the more rural, poorer northern counties, but not that the variation was relatively low. What have we seen since that time? We've seen, again, as we mentioned earlier, a very sharp increase in unemployment overall, but that increase was even more severe in particular counties. In the counties which started with somewhat worse economic situation, lower average incomes, higher poverty rates, have actually seen larger increases in unemployment. Another way to say that is the counties that were in the worst shape economically before the crisis have actually fared the worst. And the most striking example is this very dark one here, which is Menominee County. Menominee County is largely comprised of a Native American reservation. It's the poorest county in the state of Wisconsin. Uh, in Menominee County, since March 15th, 19.1% of the labor force has filed for unemployment. So the unemployment rate was about 6% in that county beforehand. You can see it was a little bit darker, but now it's 25%. This county, again, started off the poorest. Average incomes are about 40% below the statewide average in this county, and the poverty rate is 26%. So the counties which are the poorest, and in some sense, the ones which could least afford severe economic turndown, have fared the worst during this pandemic. And again, this is now basically showing the difference there. Which counties have experienced the largest increase in unemployment? And you can see they're largely concentrated amongst the north, although there's other pockets throughout the state. So again, sharp increase in unemployment overall, but with significant regional variation. And in particular, the poorest counties have tended to fare the worst. And again, this is just kind of a rough correlation. In the report that we put out recently, we looked at combining different economic indicators, including household income, unemployment rates, poverty rates, rates of public assistance, to try to get a sense of the baseline economic performance or economic situation of different counties going into this crisis. And that's what's shown on the x-axis here. So an average county is 100. If you're below that, you're actually better than average. So the interpretation is a higher value here means worse performance. That's Menominee County up there. All right, so it was in the worst shape beforehand, 30% worse than a typical county, and has seen the largest reduction in both economic activity, as measured by GDP decline, and largest increase in unemployment. Again, there's quite a bit of variation. There's not a overly strong correlation, but we do see a significant correlation here. That the counties which were initially in the worst shape have fared the worst. Just want to touch on a little bit now. I've talked a lot about what have been the economic effects of this pandemic, but this has been the overall response. And I want to at least think a little bit about, and this is based on work that Juli did that we just put out a report today, and mentioned it in our report which came out yesterday, trying to get at how much of the reduction in activity was due to the safer at home order and related shelter in place orders around the country versus how much was voluntary or had taken place before these orders were introduced. So as we saw already, a lot of the declines had actually started before this order was introduced. And you can see that here. So what's shown in this graph is a measure, again, based on cell phone foot traffic, looking at the percentage of people from this roughly 10% population sample who are home all day. So basically don't leave the home. And we can see baseline that's about 20% in Wisconsin through February up until March. Then starting around March 15th, that starts to increase. Once the safer at home order is introduced, it increases even further. So again, a lot of the change took place before the shelter in place or safer at home order was introduced. And moreover, a lot of the change that took place even afterwards could have been voluntary response, right? So people responding to the fact that the crisis is getting worse, the virus is spreading, and so on. So to try to look at some type of give a causal interpretation to try to sort out how much was due to this order versus how much wasn't, we looked at comparing Wisconsin to other states around the country which didn't have stay-at-home orders in place. And that's what this synthetic control is, this dashed line, the weighted average of different states who, at least as of the date shown in the graph, didn't have a stay-at-home order in place. And you can see that before the order was actually announced before it was imposed. Before the order was announced, these dashed lines and the solid lines line up very closely, but then afterwards you see the gap open up. So overall, there was an increase of roughly 20 percentage points of people staying at home all day long. How much of that was due to the stay-at-home order? We estimate it was roughly 4 percentage points. So it's had an effect, a significant effect, but the bulk of what we've seen, again, at least according to this estimation, was due to people voluntarily staying at home, businesses voluntarily imposing social distancing guidelines, businesses voluntarily shutting down, which all occurred before this order was introduced. Again, that doesn't mean that going forward, the order may not be more binding. Right? It's essentially locks things down in a very low level of economic activity. As the virus perhaps proceeds, as people become more comfortable in perhaps going back out to stores, then perhaps the order would have a bigger effect. But at least as of right now, our baseline estimate was that, what would happen if the order were taken away? Well, we'd probably go back to where we were in early March or mid-March, which was already a significant decline in activity. So the order seems to have an effect, but the majority of the effect has been coming from other sources, and in particular, in large part, due to voluntary reduction. Just want to talk, again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about policy here, just wanted to give a sense of the overall economic impact, but I do want to mention one thing because it is something we worked on relatively early on, over a month ago, but now we're seeing kind of the predictions or what we thought would happen start to come out. And one of the main policy responses from the federal government in responding to this pandemic was to increase unemployment benefits. Right? So normally we think about unemployment benefits. What are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to provide insurance to people when they get unemployed, to provide some consumption smoothing so that they can continue to search for a job and still remain in at least relatively good economic shape. What the federal government did was introduce, on top of statewide unemployment insurance programs, an additional $600 per week in unemployment compensation. So the unemployment insurance system in the US is done at a state level, and typically benefits last for roughly 6 months, and you get what's called a replacement rate, which is a percentage of your pre-unemployment wage. So in Wisconsin, it's capped at about 40%, meaning if you get unemployed, the most you can get is about 40% of what you got when you were working. Well, what happens if we add the $600 per week on top of that? Well, a large number of people can now earn more in unemployment than they could while they're working. Again, there's not a whole lot of hiring going on right now, so this may not have dramatic implications right now for job search. Right? So people doing better on unemployment than when they were working. But to the extent that there is still hiring going on in essential services, in industry, in groceries, in healthcare, perhaps, this would make it more difficult to hire workers. So what's shown on this graph is the minimum weekly unemployment benefits on the x-axis, and again, it varies by state. And on the y-axis is the percentage of workers in that state who would earn more with unemployment than working. And we can see that overall it's roughly about 40% of workers across the US would earn more on unemployment than working, with significant variation across states. In some states like Arizona, it's over 50%. Some higher income states are districts like DC, it's much lower. But again, on average, and again, this is a relatively conservative, this is looking at the minimum unemployment benefits. There's other people have There was just a story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying average worker could earn 50%. 50% of workers could earn more on unemployment than work. And we've seen increasing reports of basically restaurants saying, well, even if we restart, we're not going to be able to get our workers back until these extended unemployment benefits run out, which is in July. So finally, just want to mention one other policy response from the federal government has been the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, which was geared at small businesses. There were a lot of difficulties. There was basically a run on these funds. They ran out very rapidly. There's been a second round, which is just going into effect now. There was a $350 billion allocated through small businesses, meaning less than 500 employees. It allowed for 8 weeks of expenses. And this was forgivable if at least 75% of it was spent on payroll. In Wisconsin, there were 46,000 of these loans were approved, totaling $8.3 billion. To get a sense of how big is that $8.3 billion, we just looked at, well, what was the scale of the small business sector in Wisconsin? Was roughly $50.3 billion, the payroll. So if we take 8 billion, we're spending 75% on payroll. Think of that as $6 billion. So we're thinking, on the order of 10%, which for covering 2 months of expenses is actually a relatively substantial share. That said, there were a large number of businesses, particularly small businesses, who did not have existing relationships with banks, particularly banks that were administering this SBA program, who lost out and were not able to receive funds at that time. All right, so again, we've covered a lot here, going through economic impact, a lot on the labor market, but then trying to think about economic activity more broadly. The big picture is, of course, economic activity is down substantially with significant variation both regionally and across industry. I think I'm sharing. And in the remaining time here, I'm happy to take some questions. Most people did. I click on the chat and I don't know if Kim and Simeon, I think you guys were.
Yeah, so I will get us started. So everyone just type your questions into the chat, and then Simeon and I will be kind of collecting them and sending them Noah's way so he doesn't have to try to read them off the screen. So Noah, the first question is, if a Wisconsin company value is doing worse than the rest of the US, what companies in other states do you think are doing better than the national average? So what is it about Wisconsin versus the other states that might be driving better market performance, stock market performance?
Yeah, so certainly anything which is more concentrated in services which can be done remotely is doing better. Right, so actually looking across Wisconsin companies, there's one company which makes services for internet meetings, like web meetings, like we're taking part in right now, which has actually done quite well over this period. So broadly speaking, think about kind of what services and what goods are people buying now. Grocers, the locations of the headquarters of Sam's Club, Walmart, etc., are doing better. But the larger manufacturers are doing worse in this period.
While we wait for questions to come in, I have a question for you, which is maybe it's an unfair question. But what do you think in the work that you've done? What are the blind spots? What do you wish you knew about that the data doesn't exist, or nobody will let you see the data because the government collects it? What is there a piece that's missing, or do you think you've kind of got all the bases sort of covered here?
One thing in particular which we would like to get is, again, we think about what are kind of welfare costs of recessions, who does really bad, who suffers the most in recessions. the welfare costs tend to be concentrated on lower income workers. So what we're seeing are kind of averages of numbers of people applying for unemployment. We don't know the distribution, like what are the average wages of these people? What industries are they particularly concentrated in? We're not seeing at a very high frequency things like applications for Medicaid, for food share, which is essentially the Wisconsin food stamps or SNAP program, food bank visits, things like that. So I think that would give a lot more insight as to what's the scale of damage that this crisis is causing. Maybe you got one.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for more questions to trickle in, so one thing I've been spending some time thinking about, but don't have very good answers yet, is so far, not just here in Wisconsin, but more broadly speaking, when we talked about the closing, the lockdown, but also the reopening of the economy, there's been this focus on essential versus non-essential businesses, right? And I'm starting to wonder if that's the right way to think about the reopening of the economy, in a sense that, does it make sense to shift maybe to different ways of reopening the economy with an emphasis more on activities or businesses or sectors or industries where social distancing is much more easily implementable versus where it's harder, and this may or may not actually correlate very highly with what's essential versus what is inessential. So I'm not sure if you've had a chance to think about this, and if you've had a chance to sort of think forward. You've been very absorbed with sort of just gathering the data, of course, in real time. But I was curious what your thoughts on this were.
Yeah, so that's actually one thing we did look at in the reopening report that we put out yesterday. Kim actually did the work, so he can chime in on this as well. We looked at using measures of work which is done in close proximity, right, as basically a stand-in for how easy is it to engage in this social distancing. So what we did was they have these measures done by occupation, and then we aggregated them up by industry. So by occupation, just again to give a sense, this scale goes from 0 to 100. So 100 is you're working in very close proximity. So something like a physical therapist where you're actually touching someone else is 100. The lowest is a faller, which I had to look up what that was. It's from the timber industry, a guy who chops down trees, like knocks the trees down. But like poets and artists are also very low. So what we did was aggregate those up by industry. And there is actually not a very strong correlation with essential, and in particularly a lot of the industries which are getting a lot of attention these days tend to be the ones which have very high proximity. So grocery stores, nail salons, barbers, beauty salons, all of those are of course very close proximity. Things, again, some of these can be more readily adapted to working remotely, but basically any kind of professional service industry where people are essentially working in their own office, maybe there's a shared common area, all of those have very low proximity measures, and so presumably have very low risk of spreading as well. Manufacturing tends to be on the low side, so we do have a number of manufacturers who are still operating as essential businesses, but not completely. I think there's a lot that could be done there to loosen up those restrictions.
Okay, Noah, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege and say that we've got a few questions about what the sort of bounce back is going to look like, or what to expect, and if there's some statistics that might be good predictors of what the recession and the recovery might look like. You want to talk about maybe what you think the recovery is going to look like, or just any ideas you might have about things to look out for, or indicators that might help us better understand what it's going to be?
Yeah, so of course there was a lot of talk early on about a V-shaped recovery and people thinking, oh, this is like a seasonal fluctuation, basically, right? So not a whole lot of activity goes on around Christmas and New Year, so we'll shut the economy down for a while, start things back up. I think the longer things have gone on, the less confident people are in that perspective. Meaning as we've seen unemployment going up, we've seen, again, there were measures of, there's different surveys as to how long can businesses survive without revenue, and the bulk of small businesses, it's on the order of 2 months. So as this extends, and again, some of that's going to depend on how effective these federal programs are in alleviating that pain. But I think the prospect for a very rapid bounce back of V-shape is not very likely. And again, a lot of this is going to depend on consumer responses, right? So we saw as the pandemic spread, people rapidly cut back on economic activity, stopped going out to bars, restaurants, canceling travel plans, all of that before any shutdowns were in place. It's going to take a long time before people are confident enough to resume that type of activity. So restaurants, may open tomorrow, but if they do reopen, they're likely to have mandated substantial reductions in capacity, and it's not clear how many people are really going to be wanting to show up anyway. So I think, again, the estimate we did about looking at how much was due to the orders versus how much was voluntary, I think that's informative of what type of bounce back we can expect. There's otherwise, we have to think about, ultimately, at some level, it is really the virus that's driving this, right? So in order to have a substantial resumption of economic activity, we're going to need people to be confident that they're safe enough to resume a fair share of their daily lives. And that's even, that's going to take some time.
So let me maybe also pick up one of the questions that was just submitted. It's something that we haven't talked about very much so far, but the question is about the farm sector and how does this all fit into the broader conversation? How is the farm sector doing? A little bit like manufacturing, the farm sector is quite a critical part of the Wisconsin economy. So is there anything that you've done in terms of research on that topic?
So we haven't touched on that directly because basically we just don't have the data. A lot of our employment data is non-farm sector. The activity that we're getting doesn't capture agricultural industry. So unfortunately, we haven't done as much there. What we do know is going into this, I talked about, overall the economy was in very good shape. That's not true of the agricultural sector, right? We've seen increasing number of farm bankruptcies, farms closing down, particularly small farms. So going into this, some of that was driven by trade friction, some due to agricultural prices in general. So overall, that sector was hurting coming into this. So even though there has been increased demand for groceries, there has been a reduction, right? There's increasing reports of dairies dumping milk, things like that. So unfortunately, we don't have very good measure of how big has been the impact, but this is certainly an industry, amongst the ones that we've looked at, that was in relatively poor shape going in. So the presumption is, even if it's a moderate decline in activity, that could hurt this industry even more.
All right, Noah, so Professor Bruce Hansen would like to know about manufacturing plants. So he's curious, do you know if these plants shuttered because of the social distancing orders, supply disruptions, reduced demand? And with the reason that they're closed down, is that kind of tell us more about what things are going to look like when they reopen? And then I'm going to tack a second question onto that, which is related, which is, what do we know about supply chains and disruptions? There's some question also in the about the meat packing industry and things like that. So maybe talk a bit about the sort of business side of these things.
Okay, so a number of manufacturers are still operating. They were classified as essential businesses. A number of them also, though, are not. And the ones which are not, or some of them have retooled towards, producing ventilators or working on producing masks and things like that. The overall decline right? So manufacturing was one of the sectors we looked at, which actually had a substantial decline in activity. We estimated about 40% reduction in GDP coming from that, or the GDP of that sector had declined by about 40%. That's mostly due to the shutdown, the non-essential manufacturers. In some ways, right? So we talked about kind of the bounce back. The bounce back for manufacturing could presumably be faster because it's not a consumer-facing industry directly, right? So there, as long as there is demand for their products, which again may remain to be seen, there's more that can be done for abatement, hygiene. There's a number of manufacturers are basically having shifts work and change together, so limiting the overlap there to reduce the health risk of spread. So there's more that can be done to get these plants back up and running. So to that extent, again, because it is relatively low spread risk, and in the state where it accounts for roughly 20% of all output, there does seem to be at least a reasonable prospect that manufacturing could come back online. Again, what they have faced, though, as we mentioned, or as we talked about, was supply chain issues. Again, if we sort of think back to early on, well, what were we thinking was going to be the initial impact of this when we started hearing about the coronavirus back in January? We were thinking about, well, supply coming over from Asia in particular. So that has still, most of those have actually come back online. So a lot of the international supply chain components may be recovering more quickly than expected. So I think overall, the outlook for resuming manufacturing is perhaps stronger than in some other industries. But then the ultimate question is, what are they going to be producing? Are they going to have demand that they would need to meet? I don't know. I think there was a second part to your question, but I may have forgotten it.
No, thank you. I think you touched on it. Simeon, do you have something queued up?
You're muted. There you go.
No, I don't have something queued up right now, but
Okay.
Someone did ask was, apart from the obvious differences in terms of the magnitudes, what are some of the distinctions between the financial crisis and COVID-19? I mean, we haven't seen 6 million claims per week, of course, so in some obvious ways, this is quite distinct. But are there other ways that we think are interesting or useful to know, both in terms of characterizing the downturn, but also sort of maybe thinking about the recovery?
Yeah, so I would say it differs quite a bit from 2008. So just focusing on the labor market, the increase in unemployment in 2008, that recession, at least early on, started with a reduction in hiring, and layoffs actually came later. So again, there was a vast difference in terms of the speed, but also the source, right? So it was basically firms stopped hiring, so there was a buildup of people, in the pool of unemployment. This was much more driven by layoffs, right? So we've seen just shutdowns, firms laying off people. So there's that difference. The hope for the quick recovery, and the Fed has been very aggressive in expanding liquidity, expanding facilities to lend far beyond their usual remit of lending to financial institutions. So we haven't seen a financial crisis or a liquidity crisis in this case. So that would, the stylized fact is financial crises tend to be associated with longer recessions because it takes longer for money to work through the system, in essence, to get to places that need it. We haven't seen that. The financial sector has remained relatively stable. So to that extent, if we were to see a resumption of activity, there's at least the possibility that it could be quicker. So I think that's a big difference. The other big difference is, though, the kind of the demand side, right? So it's you know, it's always a little tricky to think about demand shocks versus supply shocks in an economy like this. But in some ways, there's kind of both going on here, right? There's businesses are shut down, they're not producing, but at the same time, there's less demand. Right? So a lot of the traditional approaches to thinking about counter-cyclical policy don't necessarily work in a situation like we are right now. So we're nearing on 6 o'clock, so I don't know if we want to take just maybe one.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll do one more question. It's a doozy. It's about policy, and they're talking about the role of the federal government in terms of policy. And the question particularly was about in healthcare, but maybe even just more broadly. We've talked a lot about the state of Wisconsin. What should the federal government be doing, or what have they been doing, and maybe what's been the effectiveness of that?
What should they be doing? What have they been? Well, it's easier to talk about what have they been doing. All right. So the prime federal responses on the fiscal side have been the stimulus or relief checks of, you know, the $1,200 roughly per person or larger for households, which have gone out. The PPP program geared towards small businesses, and the unemployment compensation program. So a lot of that, you know, I think it was mistakenly characterized as stimulus. I view it more as relief. We're not in a situation right now where traditional demand stimulus is going to boost the economy. This is more about giving people money so that they can survive this period of relatively low activity. The monetary side has again been focused more, the fiscal side is focused more on small businesses. The Fed has expanded lending to larger sort of investment grade businesses, expanded liquidity that way, started lending to states and municipalities as well. There's been a vast expansion of credit through the Fed. What should they be doing? That's a more difficult question. I mean, in some sense, what you would like ideally is for, you know, nobody really had, maybe apart from Wimbledon, nobody really had insurance against an event like this. So what we would like is ex post for policymakers to kind of replicate what would an appropriate insurance have looked like. So that doesn't mean bailing out states or businesses which were in trouble ahead of time, but it does mean to the extent that there's reductions in activity, particularly which are caused by, say, government fiat, you're not allowed to operate, well, then you should provide some compensation for that. Similarly, people are out of work. We're not really worried so much right now about job search incentives, so providing more generous benefits may make some sense. But at the same time, having people earn more in unemployment than working may not. So I think in broad terms, you want to think about, you know, if we could have had a plan going into this, what would it have looked like? And then try to replicate that given the instruments we have available now. All right. I think
You want to wrap us up, Noah?
Sure. No, so I want to thank everyone for coming and hope it was informative. They encourage everyone to, you know, follow our updates. We're continuing to work and to follow the impact of this crisis, both within the state and around the world. So thanks a lot for joining us, and talk to you again sometime down the road.